Gather for a very special reason, and we are delighted and blessed to host Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin. She is a native of London and is a very gifted and woman of God. She is the author of several books. She is the host of a podcast, Confronting Christianity, that address a number of cultural issues, topics, and perceptions of Christianity from those around us. Tonight, though, she's going to be speaking based on a recent book called No Greater Love. But we are so thankful that you are here.
It's so good to be with you guys tonight. The folks who organized this evening very kindly asked me what was my favorite hymn so that we would sing it before I spoke. And that was my favorite hymn, Before the Throne of God Above. But it's actually really cruel because before I speak, I'm like a loud singer. I'm like a throw your heart and soul and vocal cords and like damage your innards singing kind of gal when it comes to singing praise to the Lord. And so when I'm about to speak, I actually can't sing. So I'm sitting there like, I desperately want to sing the song and I can't sing the song. So I'm just going to share that sometimes, kindness ends up hurting people. But thank you. I am delighted to be in the great city of Cincinnati. One of my favorite people in the world, whose name is Julie, comes from Cincinnati. And Julie, a bit like Mary Poppins, is practically perfect in every way. One example of this, and I think I tell this story in my little book on friendship, so you can block your ears if you've heard me say this before. One time, Julie and I were in a prayer and sort of accountability group with a couple of other friends. And I remember distinctly Julie sitting down, and when we were sharing, the areas that we were struggling in our lives with maybe sinful desires and things that we really needed to sort of change in our lives. And Julie said, I feel like I'm reading too many Christian biographies. I'm like spending too much time reading Christian biographies relative to the amount of time I'm spending reading scripture. And I was like, Julie, some of us have real sin problems. Like, can you? I'm so sorry that you're struggling in that way, but like, I love her, really. I have to tell you guys this because it made me laugh. Last Saturday, I had two friends over who both come from Ohio. And the guy comes from Dayton, Ohio. Do we have anyone from Dayton? Okay, thank you. So he was telling me he'd moved to Boston and he met another guy from Ohio, actually from Cincinnati, who was on his same course. And he said, in Dayton, we call it Cincinnati. And his friend said, well, that's funny because in Cincinnati, we don't talk about Dayton at all. That's all I got, people. I've been asked tonight to speak on a topic which I'm seldom asked to speak on, but which I frequently sneak into talks on other subjects. Because I actually think it is the secret sauce, the hidden ingredient in the beautiful and glorious and wonderful experience that we get to have if we are followers of Jesus. And I think we have often forgotten that it's there, and we've sort of left it out. It's a bit like when you're cooking. I'm actually not a very good cook because I don't like recipes. That's a problem. But you're cooking, and you suddenly realize you forgot a key ingredient. Like when I was making banana bread muffins, and I completely forgot to put the eggs in. I was like, oh, they're kind of like flour and bananas, and that's basically it. I forgot the eggs. As David was pointing out, we're living in a time where there was a sort of nationally declared epidemic of loneliness just last year. And loneliness, it turns out, can literally kill people. I mean, people's life expectancy is going down because of the loneliness that folks are experiencing. And I deeply believe that Jesus has the answer to our loneliness problem. And I also believe that often, those of us who are part of Christian communities and churches, we're often actually missing some of this answer that Jesus has given us. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time this evening, as I've been asked to, talking about friendship, which we see in the New Testament often actually in terms of brother-sister language. It's interesting that we have that kind of family language that spills throughout the pages of the New Testament. We also have particular moments when the language of friendship is specifically used. And I want to start with probably the most extraordinary statement that's ever been made concerning friendship. And it was made by Jesus on the night that he was betrayed by one of his closest friends. So when Jesus says this, his disciple Judas has already walked out into the night to betray Jesus to his death. And Jesus knows that one of his other disciples, one of his potentially very closest three, Peter, was going to deny that he even knew Jesus 3 times that same night. And it's in that context that Jesus looks at his gathering of followers and he says these words, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." Now, if we're brutally honest, those of us who've been parts of churches for many years, we may have ended that sentence differently. In many churches, we would have ended the sentence like this: greater love has no one than this, than the love of a husband and a wife. Or maybe, greater love has no one than this, than the love of a mother for her children. But Jesus says greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And what I want to suggest to you tonight is that God has built into our biology and to our embodiment and to our lived experience the capacity for different kinds of relationship that can help us glimpse different aspects of his extraordinary, incalculable love for us. And that friendship, which we could also in New Testament terms call brother-sister love, brotherly or sisterly love, is one of those kinds of relationship. The other two that I want to look at and touch on are the parent-child relationship and the husband-wife relationship, because I think we're more familiar with those. In fact, we're going to go in sort of descending order of familiarity. Because my guess is, if you are here tonight and you are not a Christian yourself, you haven't been part of church community or reading the Bible, that hasn't been sort of part of your normal practice, my guess is that even so, you're probably familiar with the fact that Christians refer to God as our Father. And that's an idea that we see in the Old Testament, the first sort of 3/4 of the Bible before Jesus came to the earth. We see that theme sort of bubbling up in the Old Testament, but then it really kind of comes to the boil in Jesus' ministry and in the New Testament that sort of proceeds out of that Jesus calls God Father and invites us with him, if we're his followers, to call God Father too. And so what does that tell us? It tells us that the absolute best human father gives us a tiny echo of God's fatherly love for us. And interestingly, if we read through the Old Testament and if we look at some moments in Jesus' ministry as well, we'll find that God is not afraid to use maternal metaphors for himself. So one of my favorite verses in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament is when God says to his people, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast, or have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you." You know, the Lord is comparing himself to a nursing mother. See that relationship of love, see that sacrifice, see that commitment, see that tenderness. I love you more than she loves her baby. So we have this picture again, in the most wonderful mother, we get a tiny echo, a glimpse of God's sacrificial love for us. Now, side note, I don't think it's appropriate for us to refer to God as our mother. That's a whole another conversation. But we see built into our biology that picture of the kind of love that God has. We're probably less familiar, actually, even if we've been around churches for a long part of our lives, we're probably less familiar with quite how central to the Christian understanding of marriage the metaphor of God's love for his people is. So I'm going to take us on a little quick whistle-stop tour through the Bible on this. You might be familiar that in the Old Testament, we see from the very beginning in the book of Genesis in chapter 2, that God makes two humans, a male and a female, and brings them together in marriage. And then there's this sort of curious comment, therefore a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. A strange idea introduced at the very beginning of the Bible. And then we see throughout the Old Testament, we see prophet after prophet comparing God to a loving, faithful husband and Israel to his all too often unfaithful wife. In fact, it seems like this marriage is in continual crisis as God's people keep cheating on him with these other so-called gods, these idols of the ancient world. And by the end of the Old Testament, we're left with the question, like, how can this perfect, loving, holy God live with these sinful people? And then Jesus steps onto the stage of human history and says he is the bridegroom. If you think about it, it's a very strange comment for Jesus to make about himself. He never married in his life on earth. So what does Jesus mean? It's one of the ways in which he's stepping into the shoes of the Creator God in the Old Testament. He's saying, I'm the bridegroom. I've come to claim God's people for myself. And then in one of Paul's letters, so Paul, one of the first followers of Jesus, commissioned to go out and share the message of Christianity, especially with the non-Jewish folks of that time. Paul, in his letter to the church in Ephesus, describes Christian marriage as being like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his people. And he says that actually, when from the very beginning God made humans male and female, and when he gave us the capacity to get married and have sex and have children and all those things, that union that's described as one flesh from the very beginning, Paul says, this is a profound mystery, but I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. It wasn't that God sort of made us biologically and then thought, oh, do you know what? The relationship between husband and wife, that's kind of a little bit like the relationship between Jesus and his church. No, it's the other way around. God could have made us as sort of self-replicating, like, amoebas. I think they sort of reproduce asexually. Or he could have, every 20 years created another batch of humans. But instead, he builds into our biology this weird way that we partner with him in creating new life. And at the center of that one man, one woman, one flesh union is this picture of Jesus' love for his people. We see it right even at the end of the Bible in the weird and wonderful book of Revelation. When a great shout goes out, the wedding of the Lamb has come, one of the ways of describing Jesus, and Jesus' marriage to his church brings heaven and earth back together. So this is what that beautiful relationship of marriage is all about from a Christian perspective. It's actually about Jesus' relationship with his people. And this is why, sort of side note, this is why marriage is male-female and why husbands and wives are called to different roles. It's actually like Christ in the church, it's a love across difference. Like Christ in the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ in the church, it's a life-creating, flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. So marriage is meant to point us to Christ. But here's the thing. It's also meant to disappoint us. Because even the best Christian marriage could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' passionate one-flesh love for his people. So what about this missing ingredient? What about this secret sauce of friendship? If you open the New Testament portion of the Bible and you grab 2 highlighter pens, and with one, as you read through the New Testament, you highlight every verse that you find that is about marriage or about parenting, you will have plenty of ink left in your highlighter by the end of that exercise. There'll be a few verses, glorious, beautiful, wonderful verses, but actually not that many. If you take your other highlighter and you go through and you highlight every time that followers of Jesus are commanded to love one another, and every time that love is sort of described, you'll basically be out of ink. by the end. And yet we have so often, in our Christian communities, at least in the West, I don't want to speak for sort of the whole of the world because I'm more familiar with some of the church communities in the West, we've often lost sight of this. We've rightly and in a good way, I think, we've valued marriage and we valued parenting, but I think we may have forgotten all too often about the brotherly and sisterly love that is woven throughout the pages of the New Testament. And it's interesting, this is where my cultural background in the UK may or may not translate. But hear me out for a second. If you're someone who, like me, has been in churches for a long time, the Bible passages that we read at weddings, think of 1 Corinthians 13, where the Apostle Paul says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I'm but a clanging gong and a sounding cymbal. And he goes on and on. His love is patient, love is kind. He has this beautiful, glorious description of love. And we go, oh, what a lovely description of marriage. Paul isn't talking about marriage. We know that specifically because Paul himself is single. And he says, if I have all these things and I don't have love, then I'm nothing. Well, if Paul's talking about marriage, he doesn't have that love. Or think of the verse in 1 John, where John writes, God is love, and anyone who lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. At least when I was growing up in the UK, that was a classic Bible-like text for a wedding. Again, nothing to do with marriage, at least not uniquely. But if you read through John's first letter that quotation comes from, you will find commandment after commandment after commandment about loving the brothers, loving the sisters. So if you, like me, are a follower of Jesus, what are we going to do with that? What does that look like for us today? Part of the reason I wrote the book, No Greater Love, is because I actually think we haven't spent much time looking at the New Testament and asking ourselves that question. For in many people's minds, when they think about the Bible and friendship, there are two places they go. They go to the relationship between David and Jonathan in the Old Testament, and sometimes the relationship between Ruth and Naomi in the Old Testament. Both really interesting and important relationships. I don't think either of them actually map onto our kind of concepts of friendship today. So let's take a look at what the New Testament has to say to us. And let's take a look at the examples that the New Testament sets for us. So first, we have the example of Jesus himself. Now Jesus famously had great compassion on the crowds that he saw around him. He was the one who was sent to this earth because God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. The love that Jesus has is wider than the ocean and enough for everyone around the world, today, yesterday, and forever. But if we look at his ministry on earth, what we'll notice is that Jesus spends an awful lot of time with a very few people. Famously, Jesus has these 12 apostles, sometimes called the 12 disciples, all of whom are Jewish men, kind of picturing the 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament, sort of signaling kind of a relaunch of God's people. But along with this small group, he had a number of other disciples, including actually many women. Luke's gospel tells us that there are a number of women who went with Jesus, and we get glimpses in the gospels of his individual relationships, both with his male and his female disciples. And we see a level of sort of personal investment and individual love in Jesus' ministry on earth that I think can tell us something about the value that we might want to place on our relationships with others. And in fact, if you listen to some of the things Jesus says, you'll find that some of our kind of modern, in some ways, Christian concepts of the nuclear family get a little bit disrupted. So for instance, one time Jesus is teaching, and somebody comes to tell him, hey, your mum and your brothers are here. And if you've been around churches for a long time, you might expect Jesus to go, oh, sorry guys, family first, gotta go. But instead, Jesus looks around the room and he says, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And then he says, whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Now, don't get me wrong, Mary was a great mom. Like, this is not, Jesus didn't have like a bad relationship with his mother. We see his tender love for her even at the very end of his life on earth as he's hanging on a Roman cross. But Jesus is making the point that actually, if you're a follower of Jesus, your family is the church. And that's true regardless of whether you're married or single, whether you have children in the home, whether you have children who've moved out of home at this point. All of us together, if we're followers of Jesus, we're called to be family, and we're even called to be one body. I mean, it's pretty intense, the language that the New Testament uses. If we look at Paul's example, Paul wrote a number of the letters that are included in the New Testament portion of the Bible, and in those letters, we get a glimpse of some of Paul's individual relationships. So, for instance, we see his relationship with Timothy, who he describes as his son, his true son. In fact, there are a couple of other guys as well who Paul refers to as his son. And there's clearly an intimacy there. We have a couple of letters preserved that Paul wrote individually to Timothy. And we see the affection between them. We see one of my favorite letters to the New Testament, this very short letter called Philemon, which Paul is writing about a guy called Onesimus. And Paul uses the most affectionate language for Onesimus that I think he uses of any other individual. At one point, he calls Onesimus his very heart, or quite literally his intestines. It was how they talked about, we think of the heart as like not only a bodily organ, but also the sort of seat of emotion. In the Greek world that Paul was writing to, your intestines were where all the real emotional stuff went on. So it's usually translated, he's my very heart, for good reason. But let's just pause there for a minute. You know, for those of you who are regulars at this church, imagine David stood up on Sunday and referred to one of his male friends in the congregation as my very heart. You'd be like, oh, that's a bit intense. Like, that's a bit much. That would kind of catch us off guard slightly, am I right? Maybe he does this all the time. I don't know, David. Maybe he's... Or think about how Paul, in his letter to the church in Thessalonica, he says to them, I was among you like a nursing mother with her children. Now, I've nursed 3 kids, and let me tell you, it's a very intimate experience. And Paul uses that to describe how he related to the Thessalonians when he was with them. You see love just oozing off the page for Paul when he's talking to his brothers and to his sisters in Christ. You see Paul weeping at times. You see like physical affection commanded actually multiple times in the New Testament. We're told to greet one another with a holy kiss. It's funny, one of the transitions I went through moving from the UK to the US is in England there's quite a lot of social kissing. In America it seems like that is not really a thing. So I get it. You guys, you don't do the kissing thing. Conversely, when I was growing up in England, men really didn't hug each other. I think maybe that's improved a bit, but there was like a firm handshake was all you'd get from an English man to another English man. And one of the things I actually appreciate in America, I feel like you guys have been hugging, the men folk have been hugging one another. Am I right? I mean, is this, okay, good. Actually, if we are followers of Jesus and we are taking our lead from the New Testament, Christian communities should be places of a lot of affection, a lot of like tangible love. And one of the ways that we will develop those deep love relationships is by following the examples that we are set in the New Testament of how Christians get close to one another. I love how Paul refers to two of his male kind of brothers, friends, gospel partners, as fellow soldier. Now, I've never served in the military. I don't know if anybody in this room has. But my understanding is that people who are soldiers alongside one another develop very intimate bonds. You know, if you go to war alongside somebody, you train together, you eat together, you live together, you die together. There's a deep bond of fellowship there. And that's the language that Paul uses to describe two of his gospel partners. But it's not that people go to war in order to develop those friendships. That they're on mission together, and as a byproduct of that mission, that intimacy develops. And I would say to you, if you, like me, are a follower of Jesus, and you're thinking, do you know what? I'd love to have deep, meaningful friendships, and I feel like maybe I don't have enough of that in my life. I would suggest the answer is not, oh, well, find somebody where you have like a lot in common with them culturally. Maybe you enjoy the same music, or you like reading the same books, or going to the same films, and like have as many movie nights as possible. Movie nights are just fine. But you will actually grow in your love for one another by being fellow soldiers. And that can look a lot of different ways. Maybe that looks like you're both serving in the homeless ministry of the church. Maybe it looks like you're both committed to evangelism in your workplace and you happen to be in the same workplace. Maybe it looks like you're both parents and you're striving to be a witness, a pointer to Jesus in the school community that you're both part of. There are multiple different ways in which we can be on mission together as followers of Jesus. But it's in that context that we will actually develop a gospel-centered intimacy and love with one another. And here's the thing. If you're a follower of Jesus, one of the things that you will need is people who know you well enough to know when you're really struggling and who can step in alongside you, give you the hug you need, give you the word of encouragement you need, invite you over, do the sort of loving, nurturing things that all of us, if we're honest, sometimes really need. You also need people in your life who know you well enough to say, I think you are in ongoing sin in this area, and I want to help you dig out of it. Maybe it's you have a pornography addiction, and you need people in your life who know you well enough to actually help you dig out of that. Maybe you struggle with materialism, and you're just overly fixated on buying things for your house, or getting new clothes, or something. There's just like a desire for stuff. And someone who really knows you and loves you well can say to you, I think you're spending too much money on clothes. Like, I think that's probably become, honestly, an idol in your life. Like, your appearance seems to be more important to you than anything else. And because I love you, I want to help you see that, and I want to dig you out, or come alongside you as the Lord helps you dig out. Now, I don't know about you, but I have found in my life when somebody knows me well enough and loves me well enough to point out my sin, it's actually a profoundly loved feeling that I have. Because it's not easy. It's not easy to say to someone, hey, I think this is an area where you're actually really falling short of what the Lord is calling you to. But it is precious. It communicates to that person, I actually really care about you, and I believe that you can do better than this. I believe that the Lord is working in your life, and he is making you more like Jesus, and this is an area that we're just going to have to shoulder up and work on together. Maybe you're reading too many Christian biographies. I don't know. You might need a friend to just get in there and tell you that. But in all seriousness, I think when we don't have the people like properly in our lives to where they can be up in our faces, if we're followers of Jesus, we're actually really going to miss out. And I want to wrap up with another story about my friend Julie from Cincinnati, or Cincinnati, is that what you guys say? So I'm going to get personal for a second. For as long as I can remember, I've been a follower of Jesus. And for as long as I ever had sort of romantic desires toward people, they were directed toward other women. And this was something which, for many years, knowing what the Bible says about marriage, that marriage is male, female by design, and that any sexual and romantic intimacy outside of that is sinful, I knew that was true. I never pursued a same-sex sexual romantic relationship, but it was years before I talked to even my closest Christian friends about this area of struggle in my life and in my history. And the reason that I didn't talk to my friends was not because I thought they would sort of run away from me screaming or something. It was because I was afraid that they would take just like half a step away from me. And what I realized was that actually I was taking half a step away from them. Because my closest friends were letting me in on all sorts of things in their life, and this was just an area that was like off limits in what I was willing to share with them. And I remember the day that I decided to tell my friend Julie, as one of the close friends who I thought I should tell her about this part of my experience. And Julie at the time was a homeschooling mum. I mean, literally, when I say practically perfect in every way, like, I struggle to find the warts in Julie's life. I think she maybe has some somewhere. And I knew this hadn't been part of her experience or ever been a struggle for her, and I didn't think she had like a ton of people in her life for whom this had been a challenge. And so, honestly, there was a version of Julie that could have responded to me disclosing that to her with taking at least like probably a 3/4 step back. There was another version of Julie, because Julie is a very, very loving, empathetic kind of person. There's another version of Julie who could have responded to that information by saying, okay, I love my friend. She's telling me that this is something that sort of naturally arises out of her heart. So it can't really be wrong. How could I say that something that seems to sort of come so naturally to my friend is like actually sinful? There's a version of Julie which could have said, oh, well, I don't know, maybe that's something that you should explore further. But instead, Julie did exactly what a Christian friend should do. She reaffirmed her love for me, and she assured me that if ever I was in a situation where I was concerned that I was going to like fall into sinful behaviors with somebody, she assured me that she would be right there with me to help me resist that. Brothers and sisters, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're designed to need other Christians by your side and up in your face. And ultimately, none of us are here to be the be-all, end-all for another person, whether it's in marriage, whether it's in parenting, whether it's in friendship. At best, our human relationships will give us a glimpse of Jesus' love for us. But let's not miss out on that glimpse. And let's not disobey Jesus' commandment to us to love one another as he has loved us. Thank you.